In the grand theater of global politics, moments arise that alter the very balance of power. A scene once unimaginable unfolds where America, a titan of influence, bends its knee, and at the center of this seismic shift stands India, resolute and unshaken. Donald Trump, a leader known for his boldness, now seeks dialogue, not dominance. The world watches in awe as history turns its page to a new chapter of strength, dignity, and unyielding pride. This is the story of India's rise, a story of courage, conviction, and destiny fulfilled. In the vast expanse of international relations, where nations compete for dominance and survival, power is not merely measured by wealth or military strength, but by the ability to influence others, to set the tone of dialogue, and to command respect even in silence. Oh, America for decades stood at the pinnacle of global authority, its voice echoing across continents, shaping the policies of smaller nations, dictating the tempo of world affairs. Yet when confronted with the firm and unyielding posture of India, that same authority began to tremble, its foundation tested in a way few could have predicted. India, long underestimated, long viewed as a nation still finding its footing, revealed a resilience that shook the perception of power itself. This was not a story of submission, but of assertion, a revelation that America's power, once considered untouchable, could indeed be matched by the unwavering resolve of a nation with centuries of civilizational depth. The test of power lies not in moments of ease, but in moments of confrontation, when the interests of two great nations collide, and each side seeks to defend its sovereignty and pride. For decades, America had grown accustomed to seeing its demands met without hesitation, its pressures answered with concessions, its authority rarely challenged by those it perceived as rising, but not yet risen. Yet in the unfolding drama with India, the script changed. The very expectation that India would yield, that it would soften its stance in the face of American pressure, proved to be the greatest miscalculation. For here stood a country no longer defined by dependence, no longer chained to the image of a developing power desperate for approval, but instead defined by confidence, by strength, and by a vision that refused to bow. The test of America's power revealed the limits of its influence, while the test of India's resolve revealed the boundless potential of its strength. What makes this moment remarkable is not the rhetoric exchanged or the dramatic headlines that capture fleeting attention, but the quiet yet undeniable reality that India's refusal to bend forced America to reconsider its own posture. Power, when tested, often reveals fragility hidden beneath layers of arrogance. America's stance, so often one of commanding authority, began to show cracks, not because its strength had vanished, but because India's unyielding spirit illuminated the truth that dominance cannot last forever when confronted by a will equally determined. This was not merely a political contest, but a psychological one, a battle of endurance where the side that refused to kneel would ultimately set the terms of engagement. In this battlefield of pride and sovereignty, India's resolve became the decisive weapon, one that no economic sanction or diplomatic pressure could disarm. The weight of history loomed over this test. For centuries, India had endured subjugation, exploitation, and dismissal at the hands of foreign powers, each of whom believed their dominance eternal. Yet time and again, India endured, adapting and emerging stronger, never allowing its spirit to be extinguished. That same spirit, drawn from its history of resilience, now manifested in its leaders and in its people, projecting an unspoken message to the world that India was no longer to be dictated to, but to be negotiated with on equal footing. America's test of power was, in truth, a revelation of India's identity. the identity of a nation that had shed the insecurities of the past and embraced the confidence of its destiny. To understand the gravity of this moment is to understand that the balance of power is never static. America, though powerful, discovered that its influence could be resisted, that its demands could be questioned, that its once uncontested dominance could falter against the unbreakable wall of Indian determination. India, in turn, discovered something even more profound, that it no longer needed validation from the West, that its strength was not borrowed but intrinsic, that its resolve was not situational but absolute. This was a defining moment, not simply of political strategy but of national character, where the refusal to compromise revealed more power than any weapon, any fleet, or any economic policy could display. The test of America's power and the triumph of India's resolve is a reminder that true strength lies not in the ability to command obedience, but in the ability to inspire respect through conviction. America's era of unquestioned authority was shaken, not by force, but by the unshakable will of a nation determined to protect its sovereignty. India's resolve proved that dignity cannot be bought, sovereignty cannot be negotiated away, and respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. And in this clash it became clear that India's voice could no longer be ignored, that its presence could no longer be sidelined, that its power, though different in form, was equal in measure. The symbolism of Donald Trump's plea to engage in dialogue with Narendra Modi was more than just a moment of political diplomacy. It was a testament to a profound shift in global power dynamics. For decades, the image of the United States has been that of a commanding presence, a nation whose leaders rarely had to plead, whose authority was such that meetings with others were sought on its own terms. Yet here was the leader of America, a man renowned for his assertiveness and his refusal to show weakness, compelled to extend a hand, not from a position of dominance, but from necessity. This single gesture carried within it 1,000 messages, messages of humility, of recognition, and of the undeniable reality that India's stature had reached a point where even America could no longer afford to dictate, but must request. And Trump's plea became a symbolic moment, not simply because of the words spoken, but because of what it revealed about the underlying balance of influence. For America, long accustomed to approaching global relationships with the certainty of control, the act of requesting dialogue reflected a transformation in the script of international politics. To ask is to admit that the other side has something indispensable, something that cannot be coerced or ignored. In that moment, America acknowledged that India was not merely a partner of convenience, but a power whose choices could alter the trajectory of global affairs. It was an unspoken admission that the age of unilateral decisions by Washington was giving way to a new reality in which India's voice must be heard, its conditions must be considered, its approval must be sought. For India, the symbolism was even greater. To have the world's most powerful nation seek conversation rather than command was a reflection of decades of effort, resilience, and vision. It demonstrated that India's rise was not a matter of perception alone, but of tangible influence. The plea from Trump was not just about diplomacy. It was about survival in a changing global landscape, where America's interests could no longer be secured without India's cooperation. Every word carried the weight of recognition. Every gesture carried the shadow of respect. For a nation that had once been dismissed as a developing power on the margins of global decision-making, this was a defining reminder that it had moved from the periphery to the very center of the global stage. The symbolism extended beyond the leaders themselves. To the global community, this moment was a signal, a clear message that India had ascended to a place where even the most powerful could no longer ignore it. Nations across Asia, Europe, and Africa watched as the United States adjusted its tone, recognizing that the balance of global power was undergoing an irreversible shift. To allies of America, it revealed vulnerability. To rivals, it revealed limits. But to emerging nations, it served as inspiration, a demonstration that power is no longer monopolized by a single country, that determination and resilience can elevate any nation to a position of undeniable influence. India's stance and America's response became a lesson in the fluidity of global power and the importance of asserting one's sovereignty with courage and confidence. Trump's request to Modi was not born of charity or political courtesy, but of strategic necessity. It carried with it the acknowledgement that without India, America's ambitions, whether economic or geopolitical, could no longer be fulfilled. The symbolism was layered. The man who had once proclaimed America first was now, in a sense, compelled to place America second to India's consent. The very act of pleading inverted decades of hierarchy, replacing arrogance with respect, replacing dominance with negotiation. This was not merely a political exchange, but a moment that crystallized a historical truth. India's rise was real, irreversible, and respected even by those who once viewed it with condescension. The plea also illuminated the psychological dimensions of power. For Trump, whose image was built on never backing down, never appearing weak, the act of requesting dialogue with Modi symbolized more than diplomacy. It symbolized a recalibration of pride. For Modi, it was not about triumphalism, but about quiet validation, proof that steadfastness, when rooted in principle, can command even the proudest of powers to bend. The symbolism, therefore, was not in the words alone, but in the unspoken truths they carried. That power respects resolve, that arrogance bows before dignity, that strength of character is as formidable as strength of arms. In the theater of history, certain gestures outlast the speeches and negotiations they accompany. Trump's plea to Modi will be remembered not for its immediate outcome, but for what it represented. The visible acknowledgement of India's rise, the silent recognition of America's limits, and the powerful symbolism of a world no longer governed by one nation's command, but shaped by the collective strength of many. It was a reminder to every observer that humility, when forced upon the mighty, speaks louder than any declaration of supremacy, and that respect, when earned by the resolute, reshapes the order of nations. Narendra Modi's stance in this pivotal moment was not one of hesitation, nor of compromise, but of unyielding will. The world observed a leader who carried not only the weight of his nation's interests, but also the dignity of centuries of struggle, resilience, and aspiration. When confronted with the pressure of America's overtures, Modi did not rush to accommodate, nor did he soften his position in the face of what once would have been overwhelming influence. Instead, he stood firm, embodying a posture that reflected confidence, sovereignty, and a clear message that India's choices would be its own. In that stillness of resolve, in that refusal to bend, Modi's stance became more powerful than any declaration or negotiation. It was the silence of strength, the calm defiance of a leader who knew that the balance of power had shifted, and that India no longer had to seek approval but could dictate the terms of engagement. The significance of Modi's stance lies not only in the immediate political consequences, but in the larger symbolism of leadership. For too long, leaders of developing nations had been expected to bend under Western pressure, to concede in exchange for promises, to yield in the hope of short-term gains. Modi shattered that expectation. His unflinching resolve was a declaration that India would no longer be treated as a subordinate, no longer reduced to a supporting role in the global theater. By holding his ground, he set a precedent for leadership that was rooted in principle rather than convenience, in conviction rather than compromise. This unyielding will was not stubbornness but strategy, not arrogance but assurance, a calculated display of sovereignty that signaled to the world that India's leadership was no longer reactive but decisive. In standing firm before America, Modi represented more than himself. He represented the collective pride of 1.4 billion citizens, the aspirations of a nation that had endured colonization, marginalization, and decades of being underestimated. Every refusal to bow was not just the decision of a prime minister, but the echo of a nation's history, a testament to a people who had learned the hard way that respect is never given, it is earned. Modi's stance channeled that history, reminding the world that India's rise was not accidental but inevitable, the result of resilience forged in adversity. His refusal to compromise was, therefore, not an act of defiance alone, but a declaration of identity, a nation fully conscious of its power and unafraid to wield it. Modi's leadership in this moment also revealed the true nature of strength in diplomacy. It is easy to confuse strength with aggression, to believe that dominance is proven through threats or force. Yet here was an example of a different kind of strength, one defined by patience, composure, and clarity of purpose. America may have expected concessions or hurried dialogue, but Modi's stillness conveyed a message louder than any proclamation. India would decide on its own terms, in its own time, guided by its own priorities. This form of strength, quiet yet immovable, is often the most difficult for others to counter, for it does not play by the old rules of intimidation or persuasion. It is the strength of self-respect, and in diplomacy, it is far more potent than any display of aggression. The impact of Modi's unyielding will was not confined to the room where discussions took place or the headlines that followed. It rippled across the global stage, where leaders of other nations observed the transformation of India's role. Smaller countries, often subject to the pressures of larger powers, saw in Modi's stance an example of how dignity can be preserved, how sovereignty can be defended even against the mightiest. For America's rivals, it was proof that its authority could be challenged. For America's allies, it was a reminder that the old order could no longer be taken for granted. In every corner of the world, the image of Modi standing firm became a symbol of the changing tides, a representation of a new era where power was no longer one-sided but distributed, where nations once overlooked could now command the attention of the mighty. What made Modi's posture even more striking was its balance of firmness and composure. There was no aggression in his words, no reckless escalation, but neither was there submission. It was the delicate art of diplomacy sharpened into a weapon of quiet defiance. By refusing to yield without confrontation, Modi preserved the dignity of India while avoiding the pitfalls of unnecessary conflict. This ability to combine strength with restraint is rare in global politics, and it is precisely what gave his stance such resonance. It showed that leadership does not always need to shout to be heard. Sometimes the refusal to move speaks more powerfully than 1,000 speeches. From dependence on imported goods and foreign expertise, India cultivated its own industries, producing not only for survival but for global relevance. The journey from dependence to dominance was not merely economic, but psychological. For decades, India was told its role was limited, that it was destined to follow rather than lead, to receive rather than give. breaking free from that perception was as critical as building factories or weapons. It required a shift in self-belief, a recognition that sovereignty meant more than political independence. It meant the ability to chart one's own course without submission to external powers. Each decision to reject dependency, each step towards self-sufficiency, was a declaration of dignity. Whether it was the Green Revolution that secured food independence, or the development of indigenous space and nuclear programs that defied international skepticism, India proved time and again that it could rise above the constraints imposed upon it. Economic growth became the engine of transformation. The liberalization of the 1990s opened the floodgates of opportunity, unleashing entrepreneurial spirit and connecting India to the global economy. Once a nation dependent on aid, it became one of the fastest-growing economies, attracting investment, shaping markets, and influencing global trade. The Indian diaspora, spread across continents, became ambassadors of talent and innovation, their success stories reinforcing India's global image as a nation of limitless potential. What was once dependence on external validation turned into dominance through contribution as Indian leadership extended into business, technology, medicine, and culture worldwide. Strategically, India's transformation was equally profound. It moved from a posture of defensive caution to one of assertive engagement, no longer content to be a passive player in global geopolitics. Its foreign policy embraced partnerships without surrender, alliances without servitude. By diversifying its relations, maintaining ties with Russia, deepening partnerships with the United States, engaging with Europe, and building bridges across Asia and Africa, India ensured that no single power could dictate its course. This strategic autonomy became a hallmark of dominance, a position where India could engage with all but remain bound by none. Defense and security marked another turning point in the journey. Once reliant on imports for even basic military equipment, India invested in indigenous research and production, gradually building the capacity to defend itself and project power in its region. Its achievements in space and missile technology, once ridiculed, became symbols of self-reliance, respected and feared in equal measure. The ability to safeguard its borders, to respond to threats with strength, transformed perceptions both at home and abroad. Dependence on external protection gave way to confidence in national capability, a critical pillar of dominance on the world stage. Culturally, India's transformation carried a unique depth. While economic and military power are visible measures, India's civilizational strength, its philosophy, its arts, its values, added another dimension to its rise. The ability to project soft power through culture, democracy, and diversity allowed India to extend its influence beyond economics and politics. No longer dependent on others to define its identity, India's culture became an export of pride, shaping perceptions and inspiring respect across continents. This transformation also redefined the way the world viewed leadership. Once seen as a follower, India emerged as a voice of the global South, articulating the concerns of developing nations, standing firm against inequality in global institutions and challenging structures that had long favored a select few.